Okay, in this lecture we're going to continue talking about some pre-Roman history and culture, and in particular I want to focus primarily on the Etruscans, but we'll also look at what's going on with the Greeks. And what I've got here is a map, a little blow-up map of Italy, and let me get the pen to work. So what you've got here is Rome down here, and these are primarily Etruscan cities or Etruscan villages. And if you look at the legend down at the bottom, you can see where the Etruscans were expanding during this time. Now, this is a pretty early time period, so you're not really getting, sorry, I've got my cat in the background. Right now, the Romans are just really small and not growing just yet. But the Etruscans have a pretty large impact on what's going on. Okay, so as I just mentioned, we're going to talk about the Etruscans and we're going to talk about the Greeks. Now, the Greeks are pretty interesting during this time period because they are, as I put here, going on a colonization phase. So their civilization had a bit of a collapse around 1100 BC. And soon after, large numbers of people started leaving Greece, and what they ended up doing is populating a good part of the Mediterranean, including Italy. And we'll talk about some of the influences that they had on the Romans. Okay, so the Etruscans. So they started settling in Italy between 9 and 800 BC. And we know that the language that they spoke was not Indo-European, meaning not really related to Latin or other European languages. So it's thought that they might have come from somewhere to the far north or maybe the far northwest. They ended up settling in Italy and had a massive influence on the Romans, primarily because they were right next to each other. The area that they were controlling, they had lots of natural resources, and I have a list here like iron, copper, and silver, which of course really helped their civilization. One thing you find that didn't quite influence the Romans was that they had independent city-states, meaning you have a city and then you have a geographical area that it controls, and then the city, say to the north, also has an area that they control geographically, and usually independent kings. So every once in a while, especially if they're being attacked, like later with the Romans, they will form what's called a confederacy, which is a joining of these independent city-states. But normally they were independent, and this actually helped with their downfall when the Romans started sweeping through a few centuries later. I really didn't have to put this on the slide. They're agrarian, meaning they are dependent on agriculture at this point for their economy. They also have a strong military, and that explains their growth during this period. And some of their military techniques are going to rub off on the Romans. As I just mentioned, they're not Indo-European people, and unfortunately we don't understand their language yet. They certainly wrote. Their written language is related to the alphabet that we use today, and I'll talk about this in just a second. Unfortunately, a lot of the architecture and archaeology that's coming from this period is not a lot, and that's primarily because the Romans move in, they build their own cities, and everything is sort of built up and built over. If you ever go to Italy, you can find some of these Etruscan remains. It's becoming more popular to study, and sometimes you can just ask the local people if they know where there any Etruscan remains are. You can walk out into fields and see these things. They were impacted by the Greeks. Now, I mentioned that the Greeks went on a colonization phase and landed in the central southern part of Italy. And of course, the Etruscans are living in the northern part of Italy, so there's definitely talking and trading going between these two. You have a number of things that were impacted by the Greek get-togethers. One is the alphabet. So the Greeks learned their alphabet from the Phoenicians. So the Phoenicians around 1200 BC, they had a bit of a collapse in their society too, probably related to what was happening in Greece. They send out colonists, and the Greeks also send out colonists, and they end up meeting. And the Greeks saw the alphabet of the Phoenicians and borrowed it, And this is exactly what the Etruscans did. They sort of borrowed a lot of the alphabet, and then the Romans come in and they borrowed the Etruscan alphabet, which is Greek, which again was Phoenician. And so if you're taking notes right now, you're writing in what ultimately goes back to a Phoenician script. You also see art heavily influenced the Etruscans from the Greeks. Sculpture, painting, and I'll show you a bit of what was going on in Greater Greece or the central part of Italy in just a second. And also these large temples. So religion also had a big impact. Greek religion had a big impact on the Etruscans. I give here a pretty long list of things that we think were then borrowed by the Romans from the Etruscans. And so I just talked about the Greek impact on the Etruscans. And now let's focus a little bit on the Roman impact of the Etruscans. So you'll see a few things that are similar. So like large temples. The Romans start building large temples based on the Etruscan temples, which are based on the Greek. Atrium houses. So these are houses where you've got the central walls built, and then in the center, it's open to the elements. So all the rooms are around the outside, and you've got like a central atrium. This becomes a very common style of house in Rome, and it was borrowed from the Etruscans and then borrowed from the Greeks. Sculptures, the toga, we just talked about the alphabet, the numerals, some religious things. We also think that there were some games that the Etruscans were playing that get passed down to the Romans. This is really interesting. We know a little bit about Etruscan houses and early Roman houses from these things called hut urns. And what these are is, I had mentioned in the last lecture that the Etruscans cremated their bodies, and what they did is they put them in these urns. And so what you'd find in here were cremated remains, and then these urns would be buried, and then of course they're dug up. And the nice thing about these is if you look at them, we think that it probably replicates the way that some of the houses actually looked, or some of the important elements of Etruscan society. And this is borrowed by the Romans as well. One of the more famous tombs of the Etruscans is something called the Tomb of the Diver. And if you look at this first image, and what you're looking at is the tomb walls that have been expanded. So this isn't how it looked up on the wall. It was a tomb, and then you had one image here, another image on the side, another image on the side, and so on. But called the Tomb of the Diver because this character is diving. It's interesting because you can see different elements of Etruscan society. Like they're probably dining here on these tables. And this is something that's taken over in terms of behavior by the Romans. Okay, in terms of what's happening with the Greeks, I had mentioned this big push for colonization. So what you've got here, so this is Greece, mainland Greece, and then what you have are all these sort of dots which indicate cities, city-states that are set up by the Greeks. And of course here is Italy. And you can see a whole bunch of Greek city-states built in Italy between 750 and 500 BC, which is pretty early if you compare it to Roman history. You get these very large temples built fairly early, and it's Greek colonization is interesting. I know we're a Roman history class, but Greek colonization is interesting because the Greeks didn't change when they moved and started these colonies. They stayed Greek. So this one is a temple of Hera, and Agrigento is on the island of Sicily. And then you can also see other sites further north. So you've got one called Paestum or Posidonia, and here is Naples, and just above here, it's not shown on this map, is Rome. So you can see these are all fairly close together. Here's another image of some other temples of Hera, and you can see the early dates. Now, we haven't been talking about Roman history dates, but it's thought that the Republic starts, at least the traditional date is about 509 BC. So the Romans are not very organized at this period, but you can certainly see if you look, if you know anything about Roman temple buildings, that they're going to borrow quite a bit in terms of architecture from the Romans. And then in terms of impacts of Greece on the Romans, and I just want to remind you that a lot of these come from the Etruscans. So of course, writing, both the alphabet and the style of writing. So when the Romans start writing history, they're borrowing bits and pieces from the Romans. Certainly architecture, I just showed you some Greek temples, and you can certainly compare these to early Roman temples. Religion, I think this is probably one of the more common ones that people know. So if you look at the Roman deities and line them up in a chart with the Greek deities, they're pretty much the same with just different names. So ultimately what's happening here is that the Greeks brought their religion to Italy, and then the Etruscans sort of borrow some of these, and then the Romans borrow it from the Etruscans. And then, of course, later you've got art. So the Greeks are known for their art. You have impact on the writing of literature, and certainly on science. So you've got these two fairly large civilizations, the Etruscans and the Greeks, that have a big impact on the Romans.